Thank you for having me here. As was mentioned, my name is Lara. So I'm a designer with a formal education in design and visual communication. So I'm very much a maker, but I'm also a facilitator and educator of design thinking. So I'm going to talk to you about design thinking at scale, so how we're using the process and the methodology at IBM at scale, kind of give you some insight into how we've made that possible, and maybe just continue the conversation afterwards or during this. It would be really interesting to hear from you if you guys are using this kind of way of working as well in your own organizations. So I'm from Dublin. I'm coming from the Dublin studio. If any of you were here earlier for Vicky's talk, she mentioned that we have multiple different studios across IBM with designers working across different brands, different products and services. And Vicky was a great example of some of the work that the designers are doing. I'm not going to really talk about anything too technical. Mine is going to be very much high level about design as a process, a way of working, and about more kind of strategy and collaboration, okay? So before I kind of get stuck into design thinking or the kind of case study really, I wanted to maybe just set the scene a little bit. So, I'm not sure if many of you here work in very large organizations. I'm guessing that some of you do. But some interesting things happen when you work in a company with over 350,000 employees, working in over 170 countries in the entire world. Things kind of get a bit complicated and complex at times. So in that situation, I'm just going to give you a very, very, very simplified version or scenario of a typical kind of team situation and how teams might collaborate and work. So if we think about the world, right, the scale of the world, we have a designer, Mallory in this instance. Mallory, she's living in New York City. And in terms of time zone, she's working at Coordinated Universal Time at -5 hours, okay? And Mallory is a designer, she's working in New York City, but her team manager, Gerhard, is located in Germany, okay? So UTC plus 1 hour in terms of time. And then all the way over on the east coast of Australia, we have Chris. And Chris is our developer, okay? UTC plus 10 hours. Okay, so already you can kind of see visually that these three people are very much dispersed globally. And they're three people of a much larger team, but we're just going to focus on Mallory, Gerhard, and Chris for just a few moments. So they're all working together, and they all have similar goals, okay? And that goal really is about shipping a great software application in this instance, okay, for IBM. Now, they're all working together, but because they are located in various different parts of the world and they struggle with this time zone difference, things move a little bit slowly, okay? So if any of you are working in large organizations or work remotely, you'll kind of understand and empathize with these struggles in terms of working across time and geography, right? So by the time that Mallory communicates with Gerhard and Chris on the other side of the world, we're like 1-2 days in the journey, okay? So it can be a little bit slow. But also, on top of that, in terms of their team communication, there are some challenges too. So Mallory might say things like, well, I've been working with my colleagues for 5 years, but I've never seen them or met them in person, okay? We might have Gerhard saying something like, I spend most of my days in meetings or on the phone. So transparency and trust, it doesn't really exist with these people. And Chris in Australia, he feels as if he doesn't have a voice because I'm located so far away from his manager. Okay, so it's very hard for him to have a sense of ownership and responsibility in the work that these people are doing. And so they're working in silos, okay? They're working independently, even though they're part of the same team. and they ultimately have the same kind of goal, they're still working in silos, which makes it difficult to do great work, okay? Because there's a lack of trust and a lack of collaboration between these people. And what does that mean for the work that they're actually creating, right? So in this case, a software application. Well, they're all focusing on kind of different areas, or they have different individual goals and deliverables in terms of that application. So for example, Mallory, you know, as a designer, maybe she's focused for one sprint on the login or the security login for the application. Gerhard, you know, he's really focused on getting the team to implement data visualization for the UI. And Chris, well, he's looking at back-end databases and also mobile application, the build for mobile, okay? And that's all well and good, but when we take those pieces and during the delivery cycle, we want to make sure that, you know, they're unified, they speak the same language, and ultimately get shipped in one piece. Sometimes those pieces don't really match, right? They don't really fit. They're not very seamless in terms of one experience. And that can be kind of messy, right? It can be messy for the people involved, again, because it takes so long to communicate and collaborate. These are very complex systems. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of technology at play, and a lot of business objectives. So at times, it's hard to keep aligned around those objectives, and it's hard to keep the design unified as well. And what does it mean for our customer at the other end and our end user? Well, they're not very happy, right? Because they're getting an experience that maybe isn't even relevant for them. It's not really answering to their needs as an individual, and so they're not too happy, okay? And it's pretty much confusing for them. It's confusing for everyone involved. It's confusing for the customer who gives poor feedback, right? They're dissatisfied. Sales probably go down. The feedback comes to the team. Everybody gets a bit frustrated. And again, it damages trust and it makes it more difficult for these people to work together. So that kind of gives you just a little bit of a sense of what a typical scenario in a large organization might look like. And maybe, you know, you experience this yourself or you have experienced this. So what I wanted to kind of talk to you about is design thinking, right? And how design thinking might be used to solve problems like this, right? It's not so much about the final outcome, but it's about the holistic approach to solving very complex problems and innovate in new ways. And so just quick show of hands, who has heard of design thinking? Probably the whole room, right? It's a bit of a buzzword, right? Who practices design thinking or has? Okay, some folk, okay. So if you're a designer in the room, design thinking might come pretty naturally to you. If you have a formal training in design, it's sort of a natural way of working and an approach that designers really take innately to solving problems or creating, right? But it's been used by businesses and has been used for decades now at this stage. And it kind of might look like this, right? So you might be familiar with design thinking and post-it notes, but really it involves kind of rapid ideation, rapid prototyping, and working through at speed in a collaborative environment. It has become pretty popular because of a lot of work coming from companies like this and many more. So IDEO was a design agency who really popularized design thinking as a way to solve business needs in the early 1990s. And since then, it's really caught fire and it's become extremely valuable in the business world. Capital One used the methodology to understand their banking companies, right? Frog Design Agency, they use it to innovate in a range of different areas, okay, a range of different spaces. And Radford University, that's an example of where design thinking is embedded in academic programs. So we see design thinking being used in businesses, design agencies, institutes all across the world. And we have our own version of design thinking, IBM Design Thinking. You might have heard of it, you might have actually used it. It's completely open source. And so I'm going to kind of use this time to give you a flavor of what we do at IBM and how we're trying to implement this way of working across the organization. essentially we're trying to change a culture of a 106-year-old tech company, right? And we're doing this through design thinking. So this is a bit of a case study in that way of working. And so essentially our teams are working across our studios network to, I guess, solve complex technical problems in various different domains and industries, which I'll mention in a few moments. But in terms of how we're doing that and how we're approaching that way of working, we have a few principles, right, that guide us. Those principles really involve three main things, okay, and we'll dig into a couple of these, but the first one is really, focusing on user outcomes. And so what that means is we're driving decisions by making sure that we put the human being at the center of what we do, okay? So this is a radical shift for a technology company. Instead of saying, it's about the technology or it's about the business, it's actually about the end user. It's about the person who's going to be using that experience. So that has become a primary focus and a principle for us when we're using and talking about design thinking. So we really think about the user outcomes. We believe in restless reinvention, right? So like any sort of creative process, design thinking is very much an iterative process. But because, again, we're trying to transform an entire organization, we treat everything, including the way we work, as a prototype. And so, again, this is a sort of principle to guide us, that we're always reinventing ourselves and then the outcomes that we're producing. And most importantly, we believe in diversity, right? So diverse, empowered teams equals better outcomes, right? So we need a range of different expertise, skills, backgrounds, cultural perspectives in a room to make sure that we're collaborating, getting the best out of each other and moving forward, okay? So it gives you an idea of how we might approach the way we work and things that we're thinking of when it comes to collaboration. And so we follow this kind of simple methodology, this practice, IBM Design Thinking in the shape of a loop, okay? So it's kind of self-explanatory in terms of we're always iterating, right? Back to this idea of restless reinvention. We have kind of three sort of stages that we follow. And if you're familiar with design thinking, these will sort of resonate with you because many of the frameworks that exist out there, they're very similar, right, in many ways. So we've got observe, reflect, and make. And for us, when we talk about observe, it's very, very important to understand who you're designing and building for, right? So if we go back to this focus on user outcomes, we want to make sure that we're observing people in their natural environment, we're observing how they're using our digital tools, we do a lot of research up front, okay? And then using all of that informs us how we work together, and we reflect as a team. So if you think back to that story that I shared at the beginning, working together as a team across time and geography is very difficult. So coming together and aligning on our goals and forming intent, making sure that we're aligned on what we want to do as a team and where we're really going, that's very much what we mean by reflecting, right? It's reflecting as a team, it's reflecting with our customers and our end users, right? And we have ways of doing that too. Then once we have all of that research, those insights, we're clear on our mission, we start making, okay? Really important, we start rapidly iterating and prototyping, exploring possibilities, and sending things out there to our customers and end users. So that gives you a sense of, it's a simplified model, but we have many ways, when we talk about design thinking at scale, it needs to be simple enough that it's accessible for many, many people. We don't need and we can't use something that's highly complicated and complex. So we've kind of distilled it down into these 3 steps. And of course, when you dig into each of these, there are many, many more tools and resources there to help along the way. But this idea that it's not a linear process is very, very important. So if you're thinking of collaboration and human-centered design, it is very much about trial and error, iterating, prototyping, testing, and going at it again. So it kind of looks a little bit like this in a workshop scenario, right? So we're bringing people in together from diverse backgrounds and perspectives to collaborate. And when we talk about those stages, observe, reflect, and make, a lot of our teams, they're conducting research, they're empathizing using things like empathy maps, storyboarding, and a lot of research tools to understand who they're designing for. Reflecting again, they're coming together, they're aligning, we have multiple keys that help us, and they're sharing out those insights and planning ahead using road mapping tools and things like that. And then again, prototyping, rapid iteration, paper prototyping right up to high fidelity production code and design outputs. So we have over 1,000 designers in the company, but actually we have at this point about 90,000 design thinkers. Now when we say that number, it's pretty huge. Those design thinkers, in terms of their exposure to design thinking, it ranges from participating in a workshop to actually implementing design thinking with clients and actually creating outcomes that we see in the market that is design-led. And so what happened was as this started to scale, people were doing their own thing, right, to make design thinking at IBM work for them. So they were making all these random resources, and there was really a lack of governance around that. So how do we kind of unify that and make sure that people can access the same information and create, very seamless, well, as much as possible, seamless outcomes using design thinking with all of this really rich and good stuff that the community of design thinkers at IBM were creating. So we created this internal platform just for IBMers to learn material, right? So there's online lessons and tutorials where they can go through the entire framework. And we created these badges to allow people, in a way, it's like accrediting people with the skills. Design thinking and facilitation is a skill, and it's a practice. And so we wanted to make sure that people were getting the best out of the practice and then able to implement it by creating badging systems. So you move from just practicing right up to being a leader in the practice in the organization. And then as well, we've created these chapters where it's a group of design thinkers who come together and share out knowledge and share out what they're doing in an informal way, which is a really nice way of building this kind of design culture, right? Back to this idea of having a kind of grassroots design culture embedded in your organization. We've been able to do this. And it kind of looks a little bit like this, just group of people in a room, they're just hashing out what they've been working on and sharing out those ideas. And so these people, they may be executives, product owners, engineers, designers, sellers, marketers, researchers, and so on. They're all using design thinking across things like analytics, blockchain, cloud, healthcare, Internet of Things, as we saw from Vicky, security and weather. And they're using it in different ways. They don't follow one size fits all does not work and it does not apply. It's more about the mindset. And so in 2012, when the design program at IBM kind of was just launched, IBM was very much in decline, right? So an analyst actually, this is a quote from an analyst in early 2013, and the market was really paying attention, was saying, we believe IBM is effectively in decline. And at the time, the newly elected chairman, CEO, Ginny Rometty, she kind of placed a bet on design and design thinking to completely transform and help change that organization. And now today we see that revenue is moving upwards and the organization is really radically changing. And so just in October 2017, this is another quote from analysts saying that IBM stock climbs in Q3, and it's a slow burner, right? It takes time to change culture. But this is what's happening in the market now, and what we see. And so just to kind of end off, my role at IBM is very much about changing culture. And this is a post-it from a workshop I conducted earlier, and I'll read it out for those of you who can't read it. But someone at IBM wrote this, and they said, how can we convince square-headed people to a more open mindset and culture? And really, that kind of captures the essence of changing an entire mindset, right? It's not just about the outcomes or technology, it's about a set of behaviors and processes, and collectively working together. It's a challenge, but there are many, many ways, and it's about working as a community to do that. And so hopefully you've kind of got a sense of collaboration at scale, so how we work across time and geography, creating human-centered outcomes using practices such as design thinking, and ultimately that all helps change a company culture. And so that's pretty much what IBM Design Thinking is about. It's just working at speed and scale using human-centered design process. And it's totally open source, so I would encourage you to check it out, hack it, use it in your own organization if you're experiencing similar sort of challenges as I've outlined today. So thank you very much. Thank you.